order to get us out of here before, I imagine at the latest, 1:30 or so, I'm going to ask that we call this meeting of the order. Welcome to our weekly Newsmaker Luncheon. I'm Jeff Dewey, and in a moment I'll introduce AFD's Julie Baxter, who is with today's program. It's a very interesting one, and she'll explain what we're doing today. But I want to briefly mention that our Newsmaker Luncheons are open to the public, and we're extremely gratified to have so many new friends and visitors, and old friends as well, visiting with us today. There's only one caution, and that is that members of the press club and representatives of the media are the only folks who are allowed to ask questions of the speaker formally today. Of course, I'm sure that they'll be happy to stay around after and talk with everyone, but please, if we could limit it only to members of the press club and representatives of the working media here today. Oxymoron, yes, I know, working media. Old joke, but I think that it would go much smoother if we did that, and we'd be able to get out of here in about an hour, I think, maybe an hour and a half, almost, Julie. With that, I'll turn the program and this podium over to WAFB's chief political reporter, Julie Baxter. Let's clap for Julie.
If you watch the news or read the newspapers at all in Louisiana, the terms environmental racism and environmental equity are very names like Shintech, Rollins, Cancer Alley, and the Two-Lane Environmental Law Clinic are just some of the terms that you probably associate with the environmental movement. Today we're going to hear one author's claim that the environmental movement is no longer a sincere effort of everyday citizens, but a political and profit-hungry sham run by big organizations with a socialist agenda. And I say that at the risk of characterizing someone's book. But that from a man that most of you know well, Glenn Duncan. He is a former geologist for Amoco, a science reporter with a master's in journalism from LSU, and a former environmental reporter for WBRZ, that other station here in town. Fighting the claims in Goodbye Green, we'll hear from Mary-Lee Orr. She's the longtime head of Louisiana Environmental Action Network. I played Mary-Lee Orr once in the Gridiron production, and that was in a wrestling match with Governor Mike Foster. So I'm hoping that today's outcome is a little more fair than what that performance was. Mary-Lee is here to refute the claims that the environmental movement is dead, that her organization is not the last grassroots organization of significance in Louisiana, as the book touts it, and why, as she told me earlier, she feels that she has been, quote, stossilized, a verb which I'm sure that she will explain to you. We'll hear from each of our speakers for 5 minutes in opening statements, and then we'll take open questions from the floor from members or the working press, as Jeff Dewey explained to you. And then we'll have 2.5 minutes closing statements from both our speakers. Now, Glenn asked me to relay to you that if you're covering this story and you would have an interest in getting a copy of the book for your story, he does have some copies available for you afterwards. And I'm asking all of you to help us in keeping the noise level down and the crowd participation to a civil order here today. And then, as Jeff said, we'll take questions after their opening statements. We'll start with Glenn, if you'd like to come up for 5 minutes.
Well, thanks. I am very proud to be here among my colleagues. I'll try to uphold the tradition of the press club, but I tell you, there's some things I can't top. I remember sitting in the back of the room as a reporter once, and I think Bob Courtney stood up and asked Governor Edwards about the supposed $1 million that one of the principals of Champion Insurance handed him, and what did he do with it? And he stood up promptly at this organization and said, well, frankly, it was $2 million, and I didn't spend it. So I don't know if I have that kind of news to break, but there is one thing I'd like to talk about, and that is here we are in August of 2000, and I believe there are very few vital signs left of a tremendous movement that I used to cover as a reporter. In all reality, most of us survived Y2K. Our computers are up and running, and so are our businesses. But there is one thing that the Y2K bug claimed as a victim, and that is the environmental movement, as I covered it. First, let me tell you some of the conclusions or the things that drove me to that conclusion, and then I'd like to talk a little bit about why I believe that that movement has fallen off the edge of a cliff. First, as I see it, to have a movement, you need some basic things. You need an active body of participants, a very large active body of participants. You need money and structure to focus that energy into certain directives for change, and you have to have some success in actually instituting that change. Well, the environmental movement that I covered had all of those things. It was tremendous. But I believe that movement peaked somewhere around the late 80s, early 90s. It had large numbers of people involved, no question about it, including a large chunk of what we call moderates or middle class. They had school children in it, teenagers, college students, even industrial plant managers were coming up to me and telling me that they were environmentalists based on the notion of keeping the environment clean as a definition. Also, there was a lot of ink and time in the media. There was even a special organization that formed around the environmental movement, the Society of Environmental Journalists. That's an indication of success of the movement. There were a lot of political candidates. In fact, nearly every political candidate had a plank in his or her platform that had something to do with the environment, even at the most local level of city council or police jury. And there was a lot of money and a lot of participation. In fact, I remember when nearly everyone I spoke to at one time said they were, in fact, an environmentalist. However, that changed. And it shouldn't be any surprise. Any movement has a lifespan. Birth, life, growth, and then a decline. That's not unusual. I'm saying that the environmental movement is definitely in the decline and has dropped off. Now, I was very reluctant to draw that conclusion until I heard sort of what I call the last gasp. While I was writing the book Goodbye Green, Greenpeace stood up and announced layoffs of nearly 300 people and closures of offices nationwide. In fact, downsizing of what many people considered the spearheading group in the environmental movement. Well, that kind of did it for me, so I went back to really examine what's going on. And here are some of the things that I think happened. First of all, participation dwindled. You know, there was a time that I could go down to the Capitol building and see throngs of people in very colorful demonstrations. We're into August. I don't think I've seen a demonstration that's even come close to matching anything that I saw in the movement. In fact, I'm not sure we've had one down there this last session. Also, contributions dropped to the movement. People quit giving their money and their time. Broadcast and press coverage dwindled. In fact, if you polled citizens, readers, and viewers on where they thought the environment should be on their agenda, it began to fall off on the polls as well, indicating a lack of response. And all of the rallies at the Capitol ceased. The marches, the parades, those great, colorful demonstrations kind of evaporated, went away, and people quit calling themselves environmentalists. For all practical purposes, the successful, very successful grassroots movement that I covered has died. Now, that doesn't mean a concern for the environment has gone away, and that doesn't mean there aren't people out there working to improve the environment. Mary-Lee Orr here is going to prove that fact very clearly. However, what it does mean is that great, dramatic, colorful thing that we call the environmental movement has gone away. Here's a few reasons why I think so. And these are my observations. It'll be very interesting to hear what Mary-Lee Orr says. First of all, the movement basically was multiple movements being held together with multiple agendas and multiple goals. And anything like that is bound to split apart sooner or later anyway. For example, you had lots of motivated people, lots of time and money that made the movement successful. And when you have money and people banding together, you have power and political clout. And that power and political clout was ripe for harvest in the eyes of many organizations. At one time, the environmental movement in this country was, at the same time, an environmental movement, a labor movement, a civil rights movement, a movement for social change or socialism, a movement for anti-industrialism and anti-capitalism, even a feminist movement and an animal rights movement. You can't keep all of those agendas contained forever. And that's exactly what happened is it's broken back into its component parts. Also, the hidden agendas of those movements became to be aware as well to members of the movement. And the basic conclusion I'm drawing is that those people who call themselves the middle ground, moderates and conservatives, saw those multiple agendas and saw some tactics they didn't like and left and went back to coaching the soccer team or the Little League team. Because all of those organizations that came into the movement to garner membership, to garner money, to garner energy also brought their own agendas. Some of those agendas just did not sit well. Nailing spikes into trees, pouring sand into the crankcase of bulldozers, shouting, arguing, demonstrating, using data inappropriately, all of these things were somewhat of a concern to the moderate and the conservative group in America, and they're the ones that dropped out. And campaigns and movements are the same in one respect, I believe, and that is success is derived from the strength of the middle ground. And when you lose the middle, you therefore lose your energy and your drive, and you lose a very effective source of money and time to drive a movement. And that's essentially the conclusion I came to, as the middle ground left, leaving behind many people working on the environment. But right now, the state of the environmental movement, as I call it, is not a movement. We're broken off into what might be considered skirmishes or local battles or local issues. And there are grassroots people involved, and there are grassroots agendas going on. But in no way can I look at all of this and claim that there is a successful unifying movement underway. Thanks. I'm getting the nod. Appreciate it.
Tough act to follow there, Mr. Duncan. I want to thank God for being here. First, I wanted to say what an honor it is to be here today. I want to thank Julie for inviting me. I have great respect for the press and the written word. The press literally brings the news of our community into our homes. Thanks for doing such a fair and good job. Because I have such deep respect for the written word, it seems appropriate that I should talk about a book. Now to the business at hand. The word of our demise has been greatly exaggerated, as Mark Twain once said. It's easy to say we're dead when you refuse to recognize the real moms and dads and regular folks who have fought legitimate fights in their own backyards because they fear for the health and safety of their spouses and children and for their property. And it's easy to say we're dead when you not only ignore us, but attribute all opposition to attacks on our environment to out-of-state groups and people who don't live here. I'm not surprised by this book because this is what I encounter at almost every battle I get into. My opponent's strategy is to always ignore the individuals who start the battles on their own, to ignore anything that the local groups do, and the state groups like LEAN do, and simply lump any and all opposition in and link it to out-of-state groups that don't live here. This was especially true of Shintech, which I'll talk about later. As Julie said, after reading the book, I felt I'd been Stosseled. You know John Stossel. Let me be clear. I am here to tell you that the movement is alive and well, and we are effective and moving forward in ways we didn't believe were possible in the last century. When LEAN was started in 1986, there were 3 to 5 organized groups in our state. In the year 2000, LEAN has more than 85 member groups in our state, and we network with more than 100 here in Louisiana. Our board is reflective of our membership. We are black women, college professors, a Native American woman, a fisherman, a nurse, a small business owner, a civil rights activist. We are disabled and we're gay. They are mothers, grandmothers, dads, and granddads, and all deeply committed to protecting our natural resources and the health and the benefit of the people of this great state. Let me talk a little bit about the most that has ever been accomplished by a movement that, according to this book, does not exist. I will take my invisible little army anytime when the going gets tough. Here are some accomplishments by LEAN and its member groups. We're the only state in the nation to defeat the self-audit bill twice. We defeated the takings bill in Tozan's backyard. Shintech, instead of building the world's second largest PVC Shintech plant, will build a plant in Plaquemine, a third of the original size, and we're challenging that. Wilma Suber, who's our technical assistant, has gone to Japan and Mexico and Canada and represented us around the country. She won the MacArthur Genius Award, and we're proud to say we knew she was a genius before anyone else did. Florence Robinson, a professor at Southern University who teaches honors biology, who works tirelessly for her community. She won the Heinz Foundation Award. In Grand Bois, our members held Exxon accountable for the poisoning of the Grand Bois citizens. We're challenging the 5-parish non-attainment area. We've challenged the nuclear facility in Homer. We're challenging 18 planned nuclear merchant power plants across the state. We've been documenting the fact that the states with good environments have the best economies. We've been working on the total maximum daily load since more than 200 of our water bodies are unfishable and unswimmable. We've been empowering people on their issues, and we could go on and on and on. If the environmental movement in Louisiana is dead, I guess we could take over the governor's mansion and both the houses if we were alive. And some of our members just might. I'd like to name 2. Our members have moved from local activists to elected officials. Representative Clara Baudouin started working in her community and went to the Capitol and decided those folks need some help. She lists in the legislative guide that she is a member of LEAN and she was one of our original board members. Sister Albertha Hastings is elected school board member who works tirelessly for her community. There is one issue that I have to address, and that is the S word and the F word. I want to set the record straight once again about the location of Shintech in St. James Parish. On page 86, the author says, when you begin talking about, quote, the radical enviros that sounded the alert that let outsiders in, end quote, those radicals were and are the very moms and dads, grandmothers and granddads that you say you miss. They didn't start out opposing that facility, but when they learned about what was already in their community and how much pollution they were being exposed to, they decided that enough was enough. Again, I think it is very important to point out that the plan by our opponents was always to ignore the local group in St. James and Lean. Our opponent's strategy was to ignore what we did, and no matter what happened, blame the opposition to the folks on the outside, the out-of-state groups.
Oh. Want to wrap up?
Yes, I'm going to have to wrap it up. Okay. Okay, I have to bring in the clinic. Is that all right?
Yeah,
You mentioned the clinic. I'm sorry. I should have timed myself. I just finished this. It's okay. Okay, you think ordinary people who realize that they're breathing and being exposed to millions of pounds of chemicals every year can't decide without technical assistance that they want cleaner air, land, and water. And that is an insult to everyone that was moved by genuine reasons to oppose Shintech or any other permit. And again, our opponents can't beat us on the facts, so they have to use scare tactics. For example, on page 116, it states that the Tulane Environmental Law Clinic, quote, appeared to be pressing for no less than a social order. I want to talk about the fact that St. James Citizens for Jobs in the Environment were becoming informed and working on the Shintech struggle months before the Tulane Environmental Law Clinic got involved. In fact, Bob Kuhn did not want to take that case. I personally begged him over and over again. I want to talk about the fact that until the 80s, ordinary working folk, moms and dads, did not have a voice in the political system. Yes, we could march, and we could pray, and we could testify, and we could have the recycling man that you talk about in your book, but we couldn't challenge permitting decisions in the court. New dynamics and new discussions. Sorry.
We have time to.
Okay.
Gonna take questions now, and Jeff, you have something?
I want to start off. There was a dichotomy between what Glenn started saying, and I think Mary-Lee addressed it to a degree. You said that some of what were considered by moderates extreme actions of environmentalists, the spiking of trees, the gas tank, sand in the gas tanks, the bulldozers, etc., that drove some people away from the middle ground, drove the middle ground support away from the, quote, environmental movement. But yet we didn't see a whole lot of that. We didn't experience that within the borders of Louisiana, it doesn't seem. The only really, extremely exciting headline-grabbing or photograph on the front page picture I ever remember was Greenpeace unfurling the flag on the Capitol. Remember that, as a kind of a very, very attention-grabbing thing. Can you both talk about, let's start with Glenn, within the borders of Louisiana? Because to make a generalization like, we drove away the middle with the spiking of trees, that didn't happen.
Thank you. Let me start off by saying that the observation I made included a lot of national events as well. Yes, the nice thing about the book is folks like Mary-Lee and her organization were such a spearhead in the environmental movement that the state of Louisiana and the workers here were actually teaching the rest of the nation a lot about how to go about business. And you're right, we don't have people pouring sand in crankcases here in Louisiana, but we did have Greenpeacers jumping off a boat in the river, putting themselves into harm's way, and others trying to block sewer discharges, which in fact could damage equipment. So there were in fact instances in Louisiana of efforts that might have actually harmed someone or damage equipment or in many regards be considered illegal, including the climbing of bridges and the hanging of banners. Those tactics, based on what people told me who were no longer in the movement, are the kinds of tactics they weren't willing to put up with. And so that's the conclusion I draw. And keep in mind, the book is of national scope with a lot of national examples, only some of which are Louisiana, I'm proud to say, because the folks in this state were so good at leading the movement.
I'm not sure what you're trying to ask us, Jeff, but I will tell you, I saw CNN last night, and I watched Phyllis Glaser, who is a fellow activist in Texas, talking about the fact that she wants her country back. She wants her country back from the powerful and the lobbyists, and that you can take Phyllis, Madeline, Penny, all the ladies and men across the state. So the movement isn't just happening in Louisiana. And I think you're looking for us in the wrong places. I saw someone from the oil and gas industry during the self-audit fight, and he says, I don't see you at the Capitol. Just because you don't see us doesn't mean we're not there. Our folks are talking to the legislators. We are more mature. Our membership has never been more diverse economically, racially than now. Never been stronger, and I think that's true of other folks around the nation.
Does anybody else? Yes, in the back.
I guess this is for Ken. I'm a little confused with one point that the crazies took it over and are controlling it. One of your main points is that the crazies, most famous crazy group of all, is laying people off. If the crazies are dying, isn't that good news for the mainstream environment?
Is that for me or Mary-Lee? That sounds like a Mary-Lee question.
I think you don't want to answer that one.
Why don't you both address it? We'll let Mary-Lee
Okay.
address it first.
Sure.
And then,
Yeah.
Well, I know he made the point.
okay.
All right. Let me see if I understand your question. One of the things that I observed as a reporter, even during the movement and even after, is the tendency, like I said, for national organizations, outside organizations, extreme organizations, to recognize people and money that could be tapped for help in the movement. The tapping of that help, though, came in a variety of ways, not the least of which was to pinpoint local activities, swoop in to organize an effort, to grab the agenda, and to take it off in a different direction. And I was faced very clearly with many people coming to me, even while Greenpeace was hanging from bridges and in the river, folks who are, I consider local environmentalists, coming to me and saying, you know, I don't know how much good that's going to do here. We're just going to kind of sit back and let them do their thing and move on.
The question was, if the crazies are dying, if Greenpeace is laying people off, isn't that good for the mainstream environment?
Based on my premise, which is extreme behavior shoved moderates out of the movement, if that extreme behavior goes away, I would predict moderates may come back, and in fact, that's one of the points I make in the book.
I think that we're a real family. I sometimes joke and say we're a dysfunctional family. We operate at all different levels, and there's room for all of us. And we feel that folks are still participating, not just here, but all over the nation. And they're comfortable to participate if they want to hang a banner. We don't do that. We talk about the fact, Lean, that we're a homegrown, statewide organization that's here now. We live here, and we're not going away. Does that help a little bit? Clarify it?
This is for Ken. Ken, was your book done on spec or was it done on contract to anybody? Glenn, excuse me.
I followed what you might call the normal routine. I sat down to write a book, and then I started shopping it out to publishers until one agreed to print it. And so it's a nationally distributed book following what you might call traditional publishing methods.
So it wasn't done on contract.
The only contract was written as when any writer publishes a book, you are presented a contract by a publisher that says, if you agree to these things, we'll print your book. That's a normal publishing contract.
I have to say this to Glenn's face. After having read his book on Saturday, I would have to say it would almost be difficult for Glenn to have done this by himself. Some of the information that he wrote, I'm serious about this, would have to have come either from tapes that we had created or tapes that Harris DeVille had created, and some of the perspective that you share with folks is something that I hear often from them. So I don't know if perhaps your other colleagues had helped with the book, but certainly the rhetoric, so to speak, about outsiders and sort of, so I might want to give you a chance to address that.
Sure. I followed what I did normally as a reporter. First of all, I got the germ of the idea about the time Earth Day came along. I call it the Revival Earth Day. You remember the first one was in the 70s, 71. Then we had the Revival Earth Day, I believe, of 91. On that day, I was actually meeting some contacts, if you will, some sources in the media who were environmentalists, folks I've been covering. And I simply asked, what are you doing on Earth Day? This is your big day. You guys have finally got it back onto the national agenda. They told me, well, we're boycotting this day. Well, why in the world would you do that? Well, because there's too many people involved and we don't agree with what's going on, so we're just going to take this day off. That was so surprising to me. After achieving such a pinnacle of success, I thought, there is some story there. Something is going on. And so that's when I began to do the normal things a reporter would do. I called people and interviewed them. I looked at what other people in the movement were writing and were saying. I watched videos that were available. I watched educational tapes were available. And I tried to put all of those sources in the back of the book in a reference. So the question, did I write the book myself? Well, what reporter writes something of themselves? I had to have interviews. I had to have knowledge. I had to have experience. But no, there was no other people that wrote the book, no other people that took a part in it. I just followed my normal reporting procedures.
While you're there, sir, and I've got to confess I haven't read the book, what is the point? That the environmental movement is dead, or that it has been revived and restructured, or I'm not sure I understand the point of the whole thing.
I have 2 points. One, the environmental movement, as I covered it as a reporter, is dead for the reasons that I just said. The second point is, to get it back, those factors have to be cured or corrected.
Is it then a presumption that it would be better to have it the way it used to be than the way it is today?
Personally, I miss it. I covered it as a reporter. It was very colorful, very dramatic. There was a lot of success, a lot of activity. This was something I'd leave in my closing remarks, but let me say this. One of the reasons that I wrote the book, and I mentioned this to Mary-Lee and some others, is to spark a conversation, to find out where the movement is, to find out what's going on now, because I don't see it, and I haven't seen it for many years, and that was the story that my reporter's nose led me to, and the story that I wrote.
Glenn, did you get any funding from industry to write this book?
No, I did not. In fact, to explain once again, the normal publishing procedure is you write a book. It's like that writer's dream. You write a book, and then you start contacting agents or publishers to attempt to get it published. And once that I got into a contract with a publisher, then supposedly I'll get royalties someday if enough people go and buy the book. So no, I haven't been paid for the book.
When was the last time that you worked as a reporter covering the environment? And I also wanted, as a member of Society of Environmental Journalists, we're still alive and kicking and doing pretty good. I just thought I'd mention that. And if anybody's interested, I can tell you about membership.
I wish I could remember that date. The last, there's 2 phases of that. One was a reporter with a working media, full-time daily reporter at Channel 2. Gosh, I can't even remember the date. I guess 4 years ago I left Channel 2. So I remember that whatever the Christmas was that year was my last official function at Channel 2, was a Christmas party. Since then I've been a freelancer, writing and reporting stories as I saw. Sometimes I would be asked to help and assist some other stories. So I feel I've been covering the beat for a while.
Are you still doing the honest salmon thing? What's your business?
I have a day job. I'm the director of communications for Louisiana Healthcare Review. That's a new position. And then I had a company for a while. I still own and operate that company.
And what was that company?
That was On Assignment Incorporated, video production communication company.
Lynn?
A question, when you talk about the pitfalls of success, and this is for both panelists, the question is that this period has covered 8 years in the Clinton administration, which has tended to be very favorable to environmental initiatives. And the idea being that may have a vitiating effect on the vanguard of the movement, because so many of the things that they want are getting done at the national level. One, is that a legitimate case? And two, would that radically change if the Republicans came back?
I'm not an expert in politics, but let me say this. As I looked at the campaigns, the presidential campaigns, Clinton's first campaign and his second campaign, I saw a lot of lip service paid to the environment and a lot of language about the environment. In fact, we see that now in the presidential campaign, but there was a big gap between the 2 campaigns about what really went on. To answer your question, I'm not sure the successes that were promised were there, number one. And number two, if they were, and that administration left office, I don't know the impact other than that some people may feel that they've lost their person in the White House.
Mary-Lee?
I think for our folks, politics is sometimes a distant place. And we're involved in the process every single day of democracy. And it's messy, but we're there every day participating, whether it's the Clinton administration or God help us, what might be coming up. We're there to pressure our politicians to make them do the right thing. And I think some of our folks think the battles are still very far. So we're not back in the 1990s, though. We haven't stopped. We've evolved. We matured. We've learned. We adapt. We march and pray and protest and file lawsuits and do what we need to do to make this world a healthy and safer place all over the nation.
if I could.
You always ask tough questions. I'll do my best to answer.
One of the questions that has to come up here, I think, is you're still in there kicking and doing all of these things. Is the fact that it is not as visible and as prone to large-size demonstrations and so on, making it any more difficult to make advances in this area?
I think I don't have to tell you in the year 2000 that we're in a very complicated world. And we compete with very, very many important social issues. And just because a lot of our partners are not out there, and there are true partners out there, civil rights activists, labor unions, people, doesn't mean that they're not either supporting us financially, or they're writing letters, or they're talking to the legislators. So I think just because we're not out there hanging a banner, although sometimes we're marching. We marched not too long ago and had about 200 people. We had 200 or so folks over in Eunice about the power plant. So our numbers are small but mighty, but they're often very representational of a larger group. Does that answer your question a bit? He's probably going to say no.
No.
Okay. I think that you can either be in the number game and you can be into sort of the flamboyant part of environmentalism, which is fun, but this is really, really serious stuff. We feel like our people are dying, our natural resources are not protected, so we're in there every day, whether there's 10 of us or 200 of us, and I think it's a lot of perseverance, prayer, and patience in the environmental movement. It's not about all the time showy recycling men, and that's fun. It's really fun to educate people, and it's fun to do things like that, and we have a lot of fun in this movement. But as again, it's really serious. So just because there aren't numbers, I mean, you guys are mighty, even though you're a few. Nothing is more mighty than the pen. So we understand that words can be weapons or bridges, and we build bridges when we see walls.
I'd like to hear from both of you on what you think the state of the environmental situation in Louisiana is under Governor Foster versus other governors.
Oh, Lord, you need to invite me back. That's the F word. Governor Foster started out with that Wall Street ad. You already seen it, bending over backwards to bring industry in? I don't know who was getting it, but someone was. He hasn't been too aware, as best I can say. He took time out of his busy schedule to go to influential businessmen to tell them not to give to the Tulane Environmental Law Clinic, to not give to an institution, a private institution, not to give any resources to represent people like myself, moms and dads and working people. That is unbelievable to me. His level of involvement in local politics has been unmatched, I'd say, to any other governor. But there is hope. The F word is coming around. I believe that he's saying that smokestacks are not the future for us, and God bless him for it. But I think it's been a little disheartening for folks to see our governor out there in such showing such demonstrations as calling us vigilantes and bullies, and professors of the Tulane Environmental Law Clinic were what they're fat cats who are manipulating people. Do you really think we have to be manipulated to find out that we are being exposed to millions and millions of pounds? And I promised I would say this. 50 million pounds of toxics are going into Ascension Parish residents. When you start lowering those numbers, then we'll start talking about a more even playing field. Thank you, Bruce.
I feel grossly inept to answer a question that Mary-Lee Orr is so good at answering, because when it comes to specific policies, specific agendas, specific actions, this is the group that really knows that. But I can say this. Governor Foster did shine a light on some confusion, and it's part of that confusion that I've written about. And that is, who does the Environmental Law Center really represent, number one? Number two, what are the real issues involved in Shintech? Are they economic issues? Are they clean air issues? Are they labor issues? And that confusion is the rub. Environmentalism was so good and so successful that many agendas became involved in that. And so when he went down there and said, look, I found people that were for it, why is everybody standing up saying everybody's against it? That's just kind of shining a light on the confusion as far as I see. And that was the chief roles. In terms of how well he's done now as a governor, I'm going to have to turn that over to Mary-Lee, because she's the most active observer of what's going on. And I'm not gonna get on sides on that one way or the other. I'll try to stay neutral.
Brad, what would, in your view, since the environmental movement's dead, if it was going to be rejuvenated, what would a good environmental movement look like, and where should it put its priority?
I am science-driven and data-driven. My whole background started off in science long before journalism. So the one thing that I really crave and would like to see is good data, data that is considered, and data that is used to change policy or change structure. What I saw too much of, and what I call in my book, data slinging, misuse or misunderstanding of data, poor data, and incomplete data. So the first thing I would say is, somehow we have to agree on a data set. We have to agree on what we can use to make decisions on. As an example, I know here a few weeks ago there were some discussions among environmentalists and others about the environmental movement, and what really I learned there was that there is a very clear and distinct veil, if you will, of distrust between all parties. So those two things, I think, would be a good movement. One, we need to agree on what's good data and how to use it. And number two, we have got to learn to trust each other across a table in trying to solve a problem. And those are the things I believe moderates are looking for and would willingly come back to the movement if they saw those two things.
Hold on. We've got plenty of data out there. We've got plenty of reason to believe there's a problem, and we cannot wait for the body count. We have to err on the side of human health and safety. I am so tired, Mr. Duncan, of hearing that we don't have enough data. You're a journalist. You know how to do research. You know there's a lot out there. But like I said before, when we're not being exposed to millions, and I'm talking about millions of pounds of toxic chemicals every year here, then I think we can have a more level discussion about this issue. About data.
Let me ask you a question that may rest on specific data, and I'd like your take on it. That's Cancer Rally. Some say that there really is no Cancer Rally, that was just a PR stunt started by a union during a labor dispute, and the others say that the data shows that the incidence of cancer inside of supposed Cancer Rally is no higher than the rest of the nation. What is y'all's take, each individually, on Cancer Rally?
Glenn, you want to start?
Okay.
You're the one who said that.
All right. That's one of the things that I call data slinging. I had a chance to interview epidemiologists, oncologists, cancer specialists, medical physicians about that exact question. And I went to every one of those folks and asked, can you explain why we say we're living in Cancer Alley? Where's the data? It wasn't there. The higher incidence of cancer that we saw in Louisiana, and I'm no epidemiologist, and I would refer you to the book, but here's my understanding. Number one, the number one thing that kills Louisianans is heart-related ailments, not cancer. So what we ought to be doing is saying we live in the heart attack state or the heart disease state. Then when you get into what cancers are affecting us, the overwhelming cancer that affects us is lung cancer. But when you look at the rates of cancer between Louisiana and other states, there's no appreciable difference with the possible exception of lung cancer. Now, what is very clear in the data is that as a population, when we get cancer, we tend to die from it more often. But the problem then becomes, what's the cause of that? Is it lack of access? Is it lack of health care? Is it lack of knowledge? Is it lack of medical treatment? That's completely separate than environmental issues. So standing up and say, we live in Cancer Alley, and therefore it's pollution that's causing it, is a conclusion that I can't draw as a scientist, and I've seen no one be able to draw that conclusion.
C word always brings about a lot of emotion for me. Right now, though, we have folks suing the tumor registry. The first time Dr. Vivian Chen has been under oath, because we feel that the information is not given out so folks can truly see what is happening in our communities. But I can tell you that our folks are seeing clusters of neuroblastomas, of leukemias in children, of miscarriages, of problems, and these are very, very real. There's something happening here. And you better pray that we find out what it is, because the air and the land and the water that we're struggling to protect is going to be what your children, your grandchildren, and those children will inherit. So I think that we are committed as long as there is breath in our body, as long as there's those of us who can still stand, we would be talking about the fact that we believe millions of pounds of toxic chemicals. Now, let's not get off on the data in that these are cancer-causing agents, proven cancer-causing agents, that we are absorbing every single day. And you can't tell me some common sense link here, and you have to wait for data to figure out, oh my God, if you were growing a garden and you put that in there, wouldn't you think that you might have a problem with your crop? If you were building a house and you wanted a firm foundation, do you think this is what you put into it? I don't think so. We don't think so. Maybe you think so. But there's a big, mighty army of people, some of who are here today, sisters and brothers, who are saying, we're going to work on it to lower that exposure for all the people.
We're going to have the closing statements now. Go ahead, we'll take one last.
Okay, just one quick question. The question for Glenn, you made the point that there may not be reliable data or good data, and then the fact that you're now working with the Louisiana Healthcare Commission. Do you foresee that maybe a role of that group will be to produce some of these studies and to produce some of this data that you say is now maybe not as good as it needs to be?
Did y'all hear that in the back? The question was whether the healthcare commission that he works for would eventually need to use some of the data.
Or produce some
Produce
studies or
data
reports. If he's saying, you know,
to help
the data
address
is
some of
just
these-
not out there, is that group maybe one of the groups
To help
that
address some of these
would
problems.
issue
We
studies
hope
or
so.
reports?
You're going to give us heart trouble with this book. Give the movement heart trouble,
Let me
huh?
say this right now.
I'm telling you.
First of all, let me explain. It's a company called Louisiana Healthcare Review. This is, I have a day job that I live a schizophrenic life. What I do during the day now virtually has nothing to do with what I did when I wrote this book. It's a group that looks at Medicare coverage and Medicare recipients, and what we look at is best practices in hospitals and data that help Medicare beneficiaries take advantage of Medicare and use that. So it doesn't, I don't think that there's necessarily a role there. We look at real clinical data and like are you getting good care when you come into a hospital, for example?
Okay, so
Or are you taking,
hospital
right,
and
so,
administrative, not necessarily is this. good
right,
data
we're not looking at that
because
data.
it's not getting-
But the first part of your question, I didn't say there wasn't good data. What I said is, in answer to the question, what would be the components of a good movement is, we have to agree on a data set. There's too much of, my data's better than your data, and your data isn't any good, and my data, well, we're never going to get anywhere. We have to agree as a community, as a nation, as a people on a data set, and then trust each other. I think those are the two components that would lead moderates back into the movement. So let me reemphasize one more time. I'm not sitting here to say anything that's going on in the environment in Louisiana is wrong or not happening or not there. What I'm saying is the overwhelming sense of the movement is gone and is now petered back down to small grassroots groups who are trying to do what they've always tried to do.
Hey, Mary-Lee, we'll take your closing statement first, and then
Oh,
finish
wow.
up.
Okay. Yeah, I want to go last. Go ahead.
Do you mind? I don't mind her, Mary-Lee, going last.
He's going to go first.
Does it matter to you?
Does it matter to you, Julie?
That's fine, go ahead.
Okay.
See how friendly we are? Go right
Well,
ahead, Glenn.
Look, the interesting thing is I write about some of you in the book, so y'all ought to go look at it. Mary Lee, I write about a good bit in her organization. This is what I want to remind you of, what I said earlier, that the environmental movement, as I covered it, is no longer, it doesn't have the numbers, doesn't have the manpower, doesn't have the energy, doesn't have the drive in mass, because middle Americans, from what I've been told, have left the movement. One reason I wrote the book was to write that. It's a story worth telling. It's news. It had everything about it that I look for in a news story. But toward the end of the book, I mentioned there's a way for the environmental movement to regain progress, and that is you've got to get the middle back. And it's the shouting and the arguing over data and the distrust and the disagreement that fractured that movement to begin with. And so really now the discussion has to be more along the lines of how do we make progress, and not along the lines of our data is better than yours, or our methods are better than yours, or our tactics are better than yours. It's got to be a discussion that would reinvite the middle class and the moderates back into the movement. And so everything that I've seen today shows me one thing. Number one, it's just like I said at the beginning, people are still working on environmentalism. I'm not here to tell you environmentalism is gone. What I'm saying is it's become a confusing umbrella term that is now broken up into smaller groups again, so you have to find it in hidden pockets. And though hidden pockets may be locally successful, it is not a movement.
So much I don't know where to begin, but I understand being a day job. My all-day job is being a mom. One thing our authors even managed to insult our labor brothers and sisters. At the end of the lockout, OCAW formed a group called Labor Neighbor, and we have a seat on their board, and every member of their local, which is now PACE, contributes $5 a month to this organization. We're not only not dead, we're multiplying. The Mississippi River Basin Alliance is modeled after LEAN. I was proud to serve as chair of that organization for the first 2 years. We're not only alive, we are multiplying. LEAN now has a youth advisory committee, and I'm so proud of the young people in it. We're affiliated with SEEK, Student Environmental Action Coalition. So we are all ages and colors and creeds band together. Why do we think the environment is so important? It's like I told you before. It's like building a house. We need to have a very, very good base. I cannot thank you enough for this wonderful opportunity to talk about the people, because that is what a movement is. A movement is about the people that I respect and admire so deeply, many who are here. They motivate, educate, and inspire me to walk with them in this remarkable movement. I'm sorry, Julia, I got to do this. I want to have a moment of silence for those friends who cannot be here to speak for themselves. May God give us the strength to speak and tell the true story of what is happening to us. We remember Mona Stevens, who's in the book, who died 4 months after her 39th birthday of cancer. Miriam Price's granddaughter, who's in the book, who died of neuroblastoma. Of Cindy and Josh and Darnell. Of Brother Pate, who lived in Alson, who begged us not to forget that he felt he was dying because he lived next to 2 Superfund sites and many hazardous waste and chemical facilities. And let's not forget one of the first members of LEAN, Bishop Ott, who when he was dying told me he felt there was something wrong here. There were too many people from Louisiana at MD Anderson's. May their fighting spirits guide and keep us on our mission. I quote from your book, Mr. Duncan, "Where is the movement? The real grassroots movement filled with fathers and housewives, grandmothers and students. If you can show me, I'll take it back. I'll take back what I'm about to say." Sisters and brothers of the movement, would you please stand up and show Mr. Duncan your face, because we're here to represent. Thank you.
And that concludes our program. Thank you very much for attending, and I'm sure the speakers will take any questions that you might have.